Good morning, everyone. Half of the panel is from the Netherlands, so we have no choice but to start on time. If you're not sure if you're in the right place, you are, I can assure you. I'm honored to sit on this stage and introduce a new European initiative to you. With this panel discussion titled Countering the Authoritarian Turn in Europe, Is Nonviolent Resistance Still an Answer? We are launching or inaugurating the Nonviolent Resistance Network Europe, connecting scholars, practitioners, activists, as well as oppositionists, people working on nonviolent resistance against authoritarian rule, injustice, and democratic actions. This is the first initiative of its kind in Europe. Today we have 3 out of 4 co-founders of the Nonviolent Resistance Network. Anne de Jong was not able to come here and be with us in person, but she prepared a special message, and I do hope that the system will allow us to watch the message.
Hello everyone. I wish we could be with you in person at the community, and I'm happy to share some thoughts from Amsterdam to us. Across Europe and across the world, we're witnessing a worrying rise in authoritarianism. Democratic values are being eroded, public trust is weakening, and political leaders are increasingly speaking the language of fear and confrontation. We are told that we must prepare for war, that force and coercion are the only thing that can secure peace. But history and decades of research tells us something else. Nonviolent resistance is not passive. It is not naive. It is a form of organized collective power. The power of people who refuse to cooperate with oppression, who act strategically and courageously to bring about democratic change. That is the idea behind the Nonviolent Resistance Network Europe. We founded this network to connect scholars, practitioners, and activists. Those who study nonviolent movements and those who build them in practice. Our goal is to bridge research, action, and policy, to deepen and strengthen capacities, and to offer strategic support to movements confronting oppression, injustice, and authoritarianism. This is not only about resisting what is wrong, it's also about constructive action, about building democratic institutions and social movements that make peace possible. Because peace and freedom are not maintained by weapons alone, but by people who are willing to stand together, to organize and to uphold human dignity through nonviolent means. So if you like these thoughts, follow us. And if you are a scholar, an activist, or a practitioner working on nonviolence, join us. Together, we can make nonviolent resistance a stronger force for democratic change in Europe. Because another Europe is possible if we have the courage to work together. Activists, politicians, and scholars together. Now it's time to get inspired by the excellent panel in front of you. Enjoy and thank you.
Thank you, Anne. Now you know what is behind the panel discussion. Let's move to the discussion. A few years ago, we were able to say that we had just one dictatorship in Europe, the last one. Today, we are not as lucky as we were back then. Authoritarianism is on the rise. Democracy is being challenged. And these are not just Russia or Belarus that are laughing at democracy and its people. Because let us be honest here, we are not talking about the abstract systems. We are talking about human beings, people that are being repressed, people that are being killed. So let us think about it for a while, that it's not just them, it's not just Russia, it's not just Belarus. Undemocratic actions are seen everywhere. The question is, what should be our answer to that? We have exceptional panelists here on the stage that will help us find the answers, hopefully. Let me introduce you the panelists. Guido, the Graaf Bierbrauwer, policy expert on nonviolent action and democracy at the Dutch organization, peace organization PAX. Also a co-founder of the Netherlands Democracy Coalition and co-founder of the Nonviolent Resistance Network Europe. Willemijn Born, nonviolent resistance scholar affiliated with the Vrije Universiteit Amsterdam and the Center for International Criminal Justice, also a co-founder of the Nonviolent Resistance Network Europe. Felip Daza, practitioner and scholar working on nonviolent civil resistance and conflict transformation, also a professor at Sciences Po Paris. And Alisa Ryzhychenka, representative of the Office of Svetlana Cichanowska, representative for Economy and Finance of the United Transitional Cabinet of Belarus. Welcome. My name is Katarzyna Przybyła. I am also one of the co-founders of the Nonviolent Resistance Network Europe, and I have this huge pleasure to facilitate the discussion. As you can see on the screen, there is a word "still" in the title. So it suggests that nonviolent resistance was the answer in the past. But we need the proof, right? So in this first round of questions, and I plan 2 rounds, I will ask you, dear panelists, for the proof. We are in the country where solidarity movement, Solidarność, was born and won against communist regime using nonviolent means. What do we know from the past, from research, from data, from experiences, from events about nonviolent resistance? What are the lessons learned? These are the guiding questions for the first round. And Guido, I will ask with you. You have more than 25 years of experience in peace building and supporting pro-democracy actions and forces. Why do you still believe in nonviolent resistance?
That's a good question. I have to go back a little bit to my own past. And interestingly enough, it also shows I was a very slow student to learn to answer this question. Because at the year that Solidarność won the elections, the semi-free elections, I had to choose my studies. And I decided to study Russian because the Iron Curtain was falling and I was really enthusiastic about the new opportunities. But I had no idea why actually this curtain fell. I knew of the Velvet Revolution and I knew of some of the other revolutions, what happened in the Baltics, but I never saw at that point what was the power behind it. So a little bit further on the line, in the year 2000, I was ill. I had a job and I didn't feel well, so I stayed home and I was bored and I watched CNN. And there I saw live on TV the fall of Milosevic. The people that were gathering the square and moved into the parliament building and got rid of Milosevic. And it was like, okay, that's interesting. Didn't have much more feelings about it. So we move on a bit, and then that was 2003, at the Orange Revolution in Ukraine. And again, there was these massive demonstrations, all people on these squares, and I never wondered how did these people actually come on that square. But again, the regime fell, and well, they needed another revolution, and you know more about that than I do. In 2004, there was Georgia, and at that point, I knew a little bit more. I was working in the area as well, in the South Caucasus, so I had a little bit more understanding of what was going on. And you had the Rose Revolution, and I started to see some of these dynamics. But actually, it took me until 2010-11, when we started to see the signs of the Arab Spring, to better understand what was going on. And that was because of a friend of mine who worked on Syria. We were supporting Syrians already in 2002 and 2004, and some of these movements already in Syria before the revolution. And we said, as a peace organization, if we want to be relevant, we should connect to these movements. But they were very diverse. We could not touch them. They had no clear leadership, but we knew a lot of people that knew people. So we started to figure out how can we connect. And they organized fantastic things throughout in Syria. We were that close to a positive revolution in Syria. You know, probably that turned into a civil war because of the violence of Assad. But even in these circumstances, there were pockets of non-violence still existing in Syria that remained relatively safe and peaceful. That was amazing, even in the greatest crisis. So it worked, even in these spots. Also now, as we speak, my colleague from PAX is facilitating a network in Syria to support non-violent action. Not so much resistance, but they're traveling through the country and bringing people from the different places together to confront violence from the community violence that's going on. So it really works. We see it happening. So I also really like looking back, all these revolutions, also Tahrir in Egypt. What people see on TV is 1 million people on a square. What they didn't see when there was more research, that most of the leaders that were there, not always visible, but these leaders had one thing in common. Most of them were trained for a long period of time by human rights organizations, by peace organizations, by civil resistance organizations. There was a lot of solidarity from our countries to these people that helped them in organizing their movements, in feeling not that they're crazy, but they're doing the good stuff, that we could really help them in solidarity support. And it really worked in all these places. There's often a counter backlash, but even when there is this backlash, they understood the principles of nonviolence, they understood how to organize yourself democratically, and they showed an alternative to violence, an alternative to autocracy. So that I learned in 2011. I had one slight pocket of ignorance left in me, and we always helped others. And we never expected in the Netherlands that we would be next. And I don't know if you know the Dutch situation, but for a couple of years now already, we have an extreme far-right government, which is polarizing the whole society. There's a lot of tension in society. The migrants are the fault of everything. There's scapegoating going on. Everything is going on the wrong path. We see a pressure on our own democracy. So the one thing that I had to learn is I'm not talking about solidarity that way, but also talk about solidarity our way. What can I learn from these movements that we can use in our own country? So I started the Netherlands Democracy Coalition to work on our own democracy. But also we organized with other organizations the protest against the Gaza genocide. So we had first 100,000 people, then 150,000 people, then 250,000 people rallying against the genocide, but also against our government who didn't want to take action, didn't want to stop supporting Israel. So you see the power of people, they changed their policies. So the last thing I had to learn, I had to go back from the international work to my own community and to appreciate also the solidarity of others that showed me that it worked. So then I was convinced it really worked.
Solidarity, key word here, and you never know when you will need this knowledge of nonviolent resistance, right? Sometimes you feel that nonviolent resistance, this is something that people are doing in other countries to resist authoritarian rules, and then you realize that this is something that is needed in your own country because of the undemocratic turns. Thank you very much for sharing your story. We can move to Alisa, because your country is a great example of nonviolent resistance. Belarus, 2020, that was a shock. In Europe, in general in the world, but a shock that gave hope to many people, because society that was relatively passive in the past took to the streets, said no to authoritarian rule and democratic actions. When we look back at what happened in 2020, how do you assess nonviolent movement in Belarus? Failure or a success? And if you can briefly talk about what moved people, what activated them, what pushed people to the streets, because that wasn't the first time that the elections were not fair, but that time it worked. So what was this trigger that moved people?
Thank you for your question. First, I'm very grateful for inviting me to this panel, because this topic, it's very personal for me because I'm not an expert, only expert. I'm also been a part of nonviolent resistance against Lukashenko's regime for many years. And let me be honest, from very beginning, Lukashenko is still in power. Thousands of people are in prison. Activists were forced to leave the country. And the repression is more terrible than it has ever been. But if we measure our success only by these facts, this is a loss, of course. But we achieved a lot in last 5 years. First of all, and most important, we destroyed the regime's legitimacy. Before 2020, almost all countries recognized Lukashenko's regime. But now the situation is completely different. After the world saw how Poles beat peaceful protesters, how they turned peaceful citizens, not a single democratic country recognized Lukashenko's legitimacy. Second, we created alternative institutions in exile. And these institutions recognize international partners. United Transitional Cabinet, where I work, Office of Svetlana Tikhanovskaya, Coordination Council, and other. We are ready to offer people an alternative when Lukashenko's regime falls. And I think we united society. In August 2020, we were all together. People who went to the street, people who were abroad, even those who stayed at home. This unity was in our hearts. We all felt it. And we inspired each other, and we continue to do this now. And I think we also awakened our national identity through this history in 2020. And my answer to your question, Belarus 2020 is not a failure. It is unfinished success. It is the first chapter of a long, successful story. And when I look back to 2020, I understood that there were some deeper and also immediate reasons that pushed people to the street. First of all, in August 9, 2020, when official results of elections were announced, people were insulted. Because according to them, Lukashenko received more than 80% of voting. But everybody, absolutely everyone, knew that was a lie. Because in those elections was record turnout. People voting for their opposition come with white ribbons on their arms, like this, and everyone could see that such people were the majority. And Lukashenko basically treats people like idiots, and I think this became an immediate trigger. But we had also a deeper reasons that formed long before 2020. First of all, it was economic frustration. Wages were low, young people saw no future in Belarus. And COVID pandemic made the situation worse because Lukashenko told people to drink vodka and to drive tractor to save themselves from COVID. And people understood that the government don't care about its citizens, and people started to help each other independently. For example, business owner bought the masks and distribute this mask to people and to hospitals free of charge. People understand that they can organize themselves. And of course, 26 years of dictatorship. It was a second deep reason because entire generation grew up under one leader, and young people ask themselves, do I like and do I want live like my parents under dictatorship forever? And answer was obvious, no, they didn't want this. And I would like mention a couple of things that, in my opinion, had a big influence in expanding their protest in Belarus. First, it was women's leadership. Women's trio Svetlana Tikhanovskaya, Maria Kolesnikova, and Veronika Tsepkala became a symbol of movement. This was very powerful, and this made our movement more inclusive. And also police brutality. After the elections, police used extreme violence against their peaceful citizens. And this really create more among the people, I can say, people want to protect each other. People want to support each other, and that's why they went out to the street in masses. And I think, I'm sure, not violent protest or resistance work. Our protests were powerful, and this made participating in protest more inclusive. It was not protest of professional activists. It was a movement of Belarusians, teachers, workers, grandmothers, and other. People went out to the street with their families, with their children. And also we stayed peaceful even when police beat protesters. And this exposed the true face of the dictator. Because dictators always want to show that they're fighting against criminals or terrorists. But this time, Lukashenko failed.
Thank you very much for sharing your experiences and stories. This is such a powerful story. And I think one message should be underlined here is that we have to see the bigger picture when we look at what is happening around the world. Sometimes we feel, oh, this is a failure because, you know, it didn't change what we wanted. But when we look in the long term, maybe that's just the first stage, right? And when we think about nonviolent resistance and look at India, right? From 2025, we can say, well, that was a success, but they took it took them 40 years to get there, right? And we're in Poland, so we say, well, solidarity movement, that was a success, but it took them 10 years, right, to achieve that. So I really like how you assessed what happened in Belarus, the first stage of what is going to happen and change. Thank you very much for sharing your story. We will move to the country close to Belarus, to Ukraine. Although Felip is not from Ukraine, he is an expert on Ukraine, and he did research on nonviolent resistance there. When you hear Ukraine, you probably hear more or see more about the violent and the armed fighting. But Ukraine is also a great example of nonviolent resistance. People in occupied territories resisting using nonviolent means. And Felip is the author of a report on nonviolent resistance in Ukraine. So you were there. What did you find out? Can you share the stories from Ukraine on nonviolent resistance?
Well, first of all, thank you very much also for inviting me to this event. Also, thank you to you for being in these early sessions today on Sunday. So that's when we talk about nonviolence is something called like the unseen, right? So in Ukraine, for thousands of people that are taking weapons, you have millions of people acting in a non-violent way. So, and I will see that maybe one of the first elements to understand non-violent resistance in Ukraine is to understand that, similar to Poland, Ukraine has a character of resistance, has a history of resistance. You know, we, from the 91, the revolution of granite, young people, you know, fighting or demanding political reforms. 2000, the movement of Ukraine without Kuchma, the Orange Revolution, Maidan. So you have like a history that contribute to the creation of a character, anarchic character of resistance. So this first element about understanding, you know, why in 2022 in February, there was a massive uprising of nonviolence. So when I was in Barcelona, or also in Paris, where I'm teaching, and I saw, you know, in the television, you know, images of people trying to stop, you know, tanks in the north of the country, close to Sumy, I said, well, something is unique here. And it's unique because, as you mentioned, so we have many examples about non-violence, for example, fighting authoritarian regimes, movements, you know, asking for civil and political liberties in different countries. But Ukraine is a very interesting case study to understand that non-violence has a very important role even in the peak of the crisis, in an open armed conflict. And for me, this was a very unique experience to try to understand what are the logics, what are the dynamics, what are the activities, what are the actions. So with the students, at that time I was teaching in Kiev Mohyla Academy, and with a group of students, we started to systematize actions of nonviolence. So between February to June 2022, only in these 4 or 5 months, we collected more than 250 nonviolent actions. And today we are collecting more than 500 actions. And even today, my colleagues, they say, this is just the peak of the iceberg. So there are many and many actions that are happening. And it's true that when we think about nonviolence, we think about protests, we think about, you know, demonstrations, cultural resistance. But nonviolence is something more than not only protest. It's a sophisticated strategy, systems, mechanisms, you know, to confront a political opponent, to confront, in this case, Russian aggression. I will give you some examples about, you know, these concrete actions. But as following the example of Belarus with the woman leadership, it was very interesting to see that in the early stages of the invasion, women had a very important role of creating a protection system. Here, better? Okay, great. So in the early stages of the invasion, women have a very interesting role on leading the protection systems in close to the front line, because they were able to move more freely, you know, in the front line. They were not seen as a, let's say, like a threat, you know, from the soldiers. So they were able to lead the evacuation of people from the occupied territories, from Zaporizhia, Kherson, to the safe areas in the west, and also providing psychosocial support. So there was a very interesting system that was led, you know, by women activists. Another experience that was also very interesting was the creation of underground communication systems. For example, in Podolinka, in Kiev, in Sumy, there were systems in neighborhoods where the Ukrainian activists, well, local people, they were able to identify saboteurs. Saboteurs that they were, you know, for example, like members of Wagner or other actors that were trying to make sabotage in some areas. So they create a system, you know, to communicate and to understand if they were local people or they were foreigners. There were also other actions, like, for example, in the occupation territories, something that was very interesting is that during the occupation in Kherson, for example, there were local people create some sort of parallel government. So they create their own public provision services, electricity, water, security, humanitarian help, without cooperating with the occupier. And this is, at the end of the day, this is people's power. So when we talk about non-violence, we talk about building people's power and to use this power, first of all, to cover the basic needs of the people, and second, you know, to reinforce, let's say, governance and democracy. And let me bring to this point. When I think about Ukraine and all these actions that are happening, all happen in like different locations at local level. They were super decentralized. They were based on trust in the people. And it shows, if you can illustrate, we can see like a superhuman organism. Some Ukrainians were saying, we are a colony of ants, a colony of bees. We have basic rules, we have basic mechanisms for communication, we have basic mechanisms of, taking decisions, in a complete situation of uncertainty. Imagine, during occupation or close to the front line, without sometimes the support of the government. Because in some areas there were not even instructions from the national government, from the government of Zelensky. So, what makes this colony of ants? Okay, first is the history of nonviolence, is this character. But second, and this is very important, before we talk about the strategy, we need to talk about culture. There is a cultural framework. There is an ideological framework that is the driving force for nonviolent action. And in the case of Ukraine, similar to Poland, maybe similar to Belarus, a national identity is the first element, of course. Second can be, of course, we have an aggression and we need to fight this aggressor. But third, and this is very important as well, is what we call social emancipation. Ukrainians, they know where are going. They even consider they have two front lines. The first front line is Russia, okay, the front line against the aggressor. But the second front line is democracy. The values of the democratic values are very shrink at grassroots level. And one example to see this is, for example, the last demonstrations this summer when Zelensky was trying to control the anti-corruption architecture. In a question of hours, young people took the streets in Maidan and other cities of Ukraine to demonstrate against this decision and to fight for corruption. So these elements demonstrate the clear commitment for democracy. And this is very important because it's the driving force of this colony of ants. And let me finalize with one element. Effectiveness, because we have actions, we have a cultural framework, we have a history, but in reality, nonviolence was very effective. And if we take the case of Kherson, in Kherson, the non-cooperation actions against the occupation in the early stage of the invasion was able to slow down the administration of the occupier. Or even, during the occupation, the Russians had many difficulties to control the urban areas. These urban areas were controlled by the local people, and it was very difficult. And sometimes we think, okay, Kherson was liberated by the army, but the non-violence activists, they have very, very important role. And if you ask to the army today, Ukrainian army, they will tell you, without the non-violence action, with the support of the people, we are not going to be able to stand for close than 4 years fighting the force power, the force, military power in the world. So I will say this is very important, okay? I will say, and we'll keep it here because and we'll have enough time, but these are short effectiveness that happened, during the first years. Of course, resilience is also very important. The morale is very high, despite, many people that have been injured and killed. But I think that in the long term, it's very interesting because all these people that participate in nonviolent action, today, they feel they have power. And this power at the local level is very important to advance local governance. And this local governance is very important, to maintain decentralization, which is one of the most important political reforms that was approved in 2014. So this is democracy happening now in the war times. Thank you.
Thank you, Felip, for the fascinating story that should be told, right, to the people, because these are stories that are not in the mainstream. And one element that needs to be emphasized here is that many people think that nonviolent resistance, these are, some hippies with, weed going to the streets with colorful, clothes and flowers. Well, and it's partially true, right? But if we want nonviolent resistance to be effective, it has to be centered around strategy and planning. Just as people, authoritarian rulers plan wars and conflicts, nonviolent action and resistance should be planned. Without planning, without strategy, there is no effects and impact on that. And I think both Belarus and Ukraine are the examples of how well strategized and planned nonviolent resistance can be effective. So these were the examples from the field. Willemijn, we're moving to you. So the examples from the field is one thing, but we also have proof in academia, in research, because what is research telling us about nonviolent resistance? Should we be optimistic? I know there are findings that are not well known, but they are supporting the stories, right? So these are not just stories, but also data that is showing us the effectiveness of nonviolent resistance.
Yes, exactly. I mean, research shows us not only can we be optimistic, it shows us that nonviolent resistance works. I mean, we've already pointed to a lot of cases. Guido mentioned Serbia, where Milosevic was ousted. Alisa mentioned how the legitimacy of Lukashenko was questioned for the first time in his rule, how people still remain powerful in a situation that they're facing an army in Ukraine. So that not only shows us that on the ground it works, but research has also increasingly started to study why this works, why we should be optimistic. And there was one very seminal study by Erica Chenoweth and Maria J. Stephan, which was published in 2011, where they compared all nonviolent and violent resistance movements from, I think, the 1900s till 2010, about 300 significant movements. And it showed that nonviolent resistance movements were at least twice as likely to achieve their goals. And this is quite a significant finding, because these are near impossible circumstances. These nonviolent resistance movements were trying to change a regime. And we come from an era where a lot of these movements that we saw in Europe were indeed successful. Milosevic was ousted. We saw a lot of movements in Georgia and Ukraine that moved towards democratization. So in that sense, they have a lot of potential. However, more recently, in this time of an authoritarian turn, we are seeing that these movements are also facing new threats. The dictators are also becoming smarter. It's not only the movements that are learning, but so are the opponents. And that is increasingly risky. Plus, as Felip also mentioned, there is a very broad repertoire of contention that movements can use and should use, whereas a lot of movements struggle to diversify their strategy. As Katarzyna also said, strategy is key. It's required to be able to strategically reach your goals. But if you're just people on the streets day after day after day and you have no access to power, I mean, people power gets you very far, but doesn't automatically get you into the parliament, right? So diversifying strategies using a very broad repertoire of contention is really needed. And personally, what my research also really shows, so I've done a lot of research on post-Soviet states where political involvement of citizens doesn't tend to be normal. But you do need that involvement. You need connectivity, not only within society, so people need to be on the streets together, people need to talk about politics together, but they also need to have some type of access to power structures. And this is can be quite difficult if you don't have a system of voting, you don't have a system of political participation. If, for instance, as is the case in Belarus, all police officers, they get housing by the state, which means they're very far removed from society. So if you face a police officer in the street trying to repress your protest, he doesn't know you. I mean, he has no issue repressing you. But if the police officer is also your neighbor, it becomes a lot easier. And if you have access to those types of power, nonviolent resistance has an increased chance of being successful. But again, this is something that autocrats also increasingly know. I mean, there's a reason why the police force is so removed from society in repressive countries. So there are a lot of avenues that offer a lot of optimism, a lot of hope, but it can be a near impossible situation, and we're facing all of this increasing repression to mobilize everybody. But it is possible, and research has shown that it can very well be effective.
So we have the proof, even from academia, from data, that nonviolent resistance is effective, actually twice as effective as violent resistance, right? So we have the proof, the answer that it worked in the past. Let's think about today and tomorrow, because the examples were from the past. Let's move to the future and do a quick reality check, right? So is nonviolent resistance still the answer in the face of the Russian aggression against Ukraine, right? Based on research and experience, we can easily say that the best And the safest option for Ukraine, Russia, Europe, and in general the world is a change from within Russia, right? Done by people and non-violent movement. So my question is, why aren't Russians protesting on a massive scale, if we know that non-violent resistance is so effective? And why is Europe just talking security and war preparation instead of also strengthening people's power, right? If we know that people's power, that's the key. So in this round, we have 20 minutes. So sorry that it will be quick, but I want us to focus on the future and what is missing, what is needed, and a piece of advice, message that we can send. I will start with you, Willemijn. You worked on the post-Soviet space, right? So what is the recipe for the post-Soviet space? And you are a scholar. Can scholars be change makers? And what is the roles of scholars in nonviolent resistance?
I certainly think scholars can play a significant role in supporting resistance and in creating also a new fora for ideas, for the idea that maybe the state, how it is now, isn't how the state will always be, that there are avenues for change. But there are a lot of things that are required in order for scholars to be able to have those thoughts. And it is incredibly difficult in a post-Soviet space to have those discussions. So for instance, it's not in Europe, but I've done a lot of research on Kyrgyzstan. And that's becoming increasingly, even though they've had a lot of successful revolutions since 2020, it's becoming increasingly autocratic. And then you just simply see that all of the more economic-focused scholarly debates, they are sponsored by the state, there's money for that, but there's no money to train people politically, to discuss social issues, to discuss political issues. And then it becomes increasingly difficult for these scholars to continue to play a role in the debate, to awaken a new way of thinking within a country. And of course, although they can play a role, it should never always be top-down. I mean, the need for change needs to come from within society. And I think in the current context, there are a lot of cases where there is a need for change. People don't want to live under repression, but there is a struggle of, I think you've also done some research on that, on like civil indifference, that it is difficult to imagine change. But the examples such as in Ukraine and Belarus, they are broadcasted throughout the post-Soviet space. We now have access to the internet in most cases. I've also done research into Turkmenistan. The access is a little limited there, but still people will find ways to gain access to information, to see how a different future might also be possible. It takes some imagination for them to think it's possible for them. But if you're suffering, you will look for an end of your suffering. And if you see positive examples, people will still choose that. And I think the avenues, or at least there's a lot of potential in learning how you can actually achieve those results, because there's a desperate need, and there's a lot of knowledge, there's a lot of research on how people have fought for their needs, but there is often a lack of access. So that's not to pitch the network again, but also part of, I think, the responsibility of scholars to show what ways are possible and which avenues citizens can take to counter the autocratic turn.
Yeah, I think it's truly important, this lack of knowledge. I remember that although I was born in Poland, so the solidarity movement should be, you know, within me, the spirit of nonviolent resistance, it was just in 2014 that I learned about this research that nonviolent resistance is actually more effective than the violent one. And it was a shock to me, right? So this need for knowledge and access, but also understanding that people that are using nonviolent means, you know, it's easy to talk about nonviolent resistance. It's much harder when you are in the middle, right? And you may face repression. You might be tortured, right? You might be even killed. So these are some really important aspects of it. Felip, what about your experiences? Many years of experience in nonviolent resistant actions. What is still missing, right? We have data. Is it the lack of knowledge or something else that is missing, that is not letting nonviolent resistance and people's power to thrive?
Okay. I would like to start, from Ukraine and then, coming to the whole European region. So I think, first of all, in Ukraine, what we have now, after 4 years of, let's say, non-violence action, is that we have a new civil society ecosystem, right? So, yeah, we have still the big organizations like Opora, Center for Civil Liberties. We have also like independent, media actors, but we have a new political actors at the grassroots level, which are demanding a space at the political arena. So I think it's very, very important now to support these local voices, because these are the ones that they are trying to demand, and to highlight what are the needs in terms of social recovery. There is a threat of political cooptation by the, let's say, big political parties and big political foundations. But I think it will be one key step will be to support and to empower these voices to participate in the national decision, regional or local decision-making processes. Another key element, I think, will be also to reinforce the cooperation between municipalities, local government, and these actors, because after some years there are also some, let's say, political tensions, because there are, of course, these actors, they have political power, and sometimes there are some distrust, from the authorities. So there are many interesting cases in Vinnytsia or in other areas where there is a very interesting synergy between these two levels, which is very, very important in terms of crisis management, in terms of responding to the emerging crisis today in Ukraine, like, for example, in Sumy, when there were recently an invasion, in some areas close to the border, and there was a need for evacuation of people. So this is the first level. For the second level, and maybe Alisa will go deeper into this element, I think the regional or the regional component is very important, because if we take a look, for example, in Valencia, in Spain, or in Tbilisi, in Georgia, we have like a bubbles where Ukrainians, Belarusians, and Russians, they are coming together, okay? They share a common language, and they are able to discuss, cultural issues, but also political aspects. And there's very interesting, dynamics happening there. So there is a really a space for gathering, for discussing. And this is very important also to convince, Russia audience, okay? And we need to understand that, of course, Russia is a big country. We have many interesting separatist movements in other regions, out of Moscow, And I think that in this level, it will be very important. This is something very interesting we are also exploring, is that how we can support dissidence movements which are decentralized, like Belarus, right? You have people inside the country which are fighting in neighborhoods at local level, but also you have a structure, the diaspora, which is spread, in Estonia, in Spain, in France, etc., which are can send money and can bring, support, or even support to bring people out of the country. So how to support these decentralized regional structures, okay? And the final level, I would say European, my students at Paris, they are saying, well, I mean, what is this nonviolence action at the beginning? Because this is the first subject we are teaching in Science Po, and they say, well, for the first time, you are giving us something very, very concrete to fight authoritarianism. And we give examples, from Otpor in Serbia, to Belarus, to Ukraine, Poland, and they say, this is something concrete. These are concrete case studies that it work in certain situations. So I think that nonviolence has a very, very, a very important utility in these current times, but we need to invest. We need to recognize. We need to support the nonviolence infrastructure. It's the same when you go to a hospital and you go to the triage, you enter, and depending on what you have, you go to one department, you want to go to one unit, and there's a whole system, right? A technological system, you have human resources, you have like a structure. So the same if you take a look on, on the armies, right? So it's a whole, infrastructure. So we need also to invest on non-violent infrastructure. And for that, I think that the network is a very interesting step, to elaborate and to deepen into the discipline of non-violence. But we need also to create, to bring also funding for activists, to create this structure. One of the main threats that we have now is that due to the Trump decision of, frozen the USAID and to dismantle USAID agency, so you have like hundreds of organizations in Georgia or Ukraine, probably here also, they suffered, from these reductions. And some of them, they are disappearing. Local media as well. And we have situations where local media close to the front line in Ukraine, they cannot continue working. And this is what is creating a problem on penetration of disinformation. So now there is a new wave of disinformation in Zaporizhia, in Kherson, in areas of the Dnipropetrovsk, etc. So I think it's very important to understand that the investment is key in my opinion. And let me finalize with one element. So we are in the era of hybrid warfare and the use of technology, which means that, of course, we have traditional military tactics, artillery and all this stuff, but we are seeing more and more the use of non-military, tactics and actions, like cyber attacks, misinformation, false flag operations. And we have even information recently about the ordinary citizens from Russia that are spying, in different European countries, like Poland, for example. So how we can, use non-violence to, let's say, to defend or counterattack these strategies. And I think here there is a very important role that non-violence can play. And we can deepen into later on, maybe during the coffee as well.
Wonderful. Thank you, Felip. A need for synergy, a need for support, a need for space. And the Nonviolent Resistance Network Europe is trying to answer to some of these needs. Alisa, I'm moving to you. We can learn a lot from Belarus. As Guido mentioned, there was a moment when solidarity was needed in Belarus, and we wanted to show solidarity to the people in Belarus. And now we all need solidarity and also a piece of advice. So what can social movements around the world, especially in Europe, learn from Belarus? And if we have time, because we have just 8 minutes left, I would be really interested in learning about how can diaspora change an authoritarian regime, because Belarus is an interesting case. Almost all opposition leaders are either in jail or outside Belarus, right? So diaspora is actually leading the change. If you can, briefly answer this very complicated question.
Okay, let me start first with the main lessons from Belarusian experience. Nonviolent protest is powerful, but it is not sufficient. Our peaceful approach gives us moral authority, but it is not enough that authoritarian regime to fall. And I think dictatorship is like a wall with cracks. And while it stands, nobody sees these cracks. But when there are many cracks, it falls instantly. And our main task, like a diaspora, to create these cracks through economic sanctions, through international isolation, through alternative institutions, through continued resistance, through supporting civil society in exile, and, for example, documenting regime crimes, and keeping international attention in our agenda, in our problem, what happens in Belarus. In this case, diaspora can help and can do many important things. They can organize conferences, they can meet officials and politics, they can support financial independent media, they can support political prisoners and their families, and they can also preserve culture and national identity. And this really relevant for Belarus and for Europe when we see how imposed Russian world of us. And I think diaspora cannot replace movement inside the country, but only together from outside, from inside, we can achieve a real result, sustainable result, and establish democracy in our country. And only diaspora can have opportunity to help us to support people inside the country, to give them legal financial support, because we were not ready that Lukashenko's regime and his brutality has no limits in to his brutality. That's why we should be prepared, we should be ready, and we should work together.
We are in this together. That's the most powerful message that we can get from this panel discussion, but we still have time for the last question, a very tough one, Guido, for you. A lot has been said here during the Freedom Games conference about security, total defense, etc. And we are talking about nonviolent resistance here, right? So can nonviolent resistance keep Europe safe?
Well, I think most of us recognize nowadays that we are already in a kind of war with Russia. We are in what Felipe also said, in a hybrid war. And I'm not a military guy, but I know that in military terms you have defense and offense. So one thing, we need our defense to be better and more holistic and more total in that sense, so that also nonviolent action can play a very important role in making our societies more resilient for external pressures, for the autocrats that meddle in our societies. And that's what Putin is, of course, doing in all our societies. He's meddling in our societies. So that comes to the offensive part, and I think that is something we forget very often. In the past, we did that way more. He is intervening in our countries, so why are we not intervening in his country? And not in military sense. We're not going to bomb Moscow to get regime change. Of course not. The change will come and should come from within, from the people of Russia itself, from the people from Belarus itself. But we can help them, and we can have in our solidarity support them. What often is needed is they need training, all the lessons from Gene Sharp and about strategic nonviolence, all the lessons from other movements that have been successful, the academics that can bring that in. So we should be an integrated part of that struggle. And for me, I don't want to be, as a nonviolent action actor, to be part of the military system, but it's an alternative. We should not only fight this war on military terms. It's way more a fight of democracy against anti-democrats. And I think you can fight that war way better with nonviolent action and civil resistance than with military means. You cannot bomb people to democracy. That just doesn't work. So I think, yes, this is, for me, it's the only way. So it's not, is it still possible? One thing that's also needed is I like what you said. It's the tip of the iceberg. What you documented. It is always happening everywhere. It's not always recognized as such, but it's always happening everywhere. So we should showcase that, show that even in Russia there's many ways that people resist, maybe in their private life, maybe a little bit in collective action. There are women groups that organize themselves, they're feminists against Putin and war. So there's a lot of stuff more happening underground that we don't know of. But it is always happening. Where there's an autocracy, there will be a counter pressure, there will be the resistance, there's always resistance. And I think our task is also, if you come in a situation of resistance, you have a couple of options. One, am I going to do it violently, or am I going to do it non-violently? We believe, and we have the evidence on the side, that non-violent way is more effective. So we have to convince people you should better do it non-violent. The second option is that people have, am I going to do it alone without any training whatsoever and probably fail, or am I going to teach myself in doing it properly? So you do it strategically, you unite people, and you make sure that it is effective, and we can help with that. So there's a lot that needs to be done, but there is no, for me, there's no alternative than nonviolent action in this keeping Europe safe.
And this is an excellent ending of this panel discussion. Thank you very much for fascinating stories, data and proof. Dear guests, colleagues, friends, I can now say that the Nonviolent Resistance Network Europe is officially launched. We believe in people's power in making social changes, even, regime changes, right? And we have proof. We encourage you to follow us on LinkedIn, soon on website. We are here to talk if you want to collaborate with us and if you want to join the network. Thank you very much for today's discussion. Thank you.
PL Music Video Awards, festiwal polskich wideoklipów, spotkania, projekcje, warsztaty, do tego gala finałowa i wybór najlepszych polskich teledysków. Zapraszamy do Łodzi 4-6 grudnia, szczegóły na www.plmva.com.
It can look like this, or like this. It is threatened, but it is our responsibility to protect it. For each person, it means something different. But when we reach it, we all know what it looks like, what it sounds like, or how it feels. And if we all fight for it, it will eventually bring us together. Freedom.
Polska stolica kultury. Jesteś na miejscu.
Kiedy zapala się lampka on air, to jest najlepszy moment.
Nie ma jednego instrumentu, który lubię najbardziej. To zawsze jest kontekst.
Uwielbiam sport bez obrazu właśnie z tej perspektywy, kiedy to ja mogę ten obraz kreować. Pusty stadion nie jest cichy. Tam gołębie startują.
Jak ja bym chciała, żeby z mojego radia było słychać "będzie okej".
Ono może być cichutko w tle. Radio, które jest przyjacielem tego odbiorcy, przyjacielem człowieka.
W kinie doceniam prawdziwe emocje.
Na boisku pilnuję czystej gry.
W kuchni poszukuję autentycznych smaków.
Ale w internecie jest to trudniejsze.
W internecie wobec informacji też trzeba być sędzią. Dezinformacja jest jak bramka strzelona ze spalonego.
Więc jeśli coś we mnie wzbudza emocje, daję sobie czas. Może ktoś specjalnie chce mnie zagotować, bym uległa manipulacji.
Filtruj informacje.
Sprawdzaj ich źródła.
Nie masz pewności? Nie udostępniaj.
Postaw na czysty przekaz.
Do PKO Banku Polskiego przenosi się nowy klient.
Weź się, przenieść się jest easy. Czaruś, wytłumacz.
Otwierasz konto w PKO Banku Polskim i masz święty spokój. Przeniosą kasę i zlecenia stałe, a pracodawcę poinformują. Ogarniesz to przez internet. Bo to dobry bank jest.
Ej, widzę cię. Wolisz w oddziale? Dawaj do nas.
Otwórz konto w PKO Banku Polskim i dołącz do 12 milionów klientów. PKO, twój bank polski.
Myślisz, że to ktoś wyjątkowy. Miłośnik kultury. Kto sypie cytatami z pamięci. A to może być ktoś, kto na wakacje pakuje książkę. Tę samą co rok temu. To możesz być ty. Bo czytanie nie jest dla wybranych. Jest dla wszystkich. Podziel się tym.
Well, Atlas Network is, as the name suggests, a network, and it's global. We work all around the world. We're based in the U.S. It's a network, that is to say, organizations that share common values of limited government, of free enterprise, personal liberty, of personal responsibility.
Atlas Network provides training and support to help build capacity, but most importantly, we give our partners the tools they need to be successful.
Do zgłoszeń? Gotowi? Start!
Ja zgłoszę bibliotekę!
Ja, pierwszy pasem w gminie.
Ja amfiteatr od naszej orkiestry.
Wszystko w waszych rękach. Co powstanie dzięki wsparciu totalizatora sportowego w twojej okolicy? Zgłoś obiekt sportowy lub kulturalny. Wejdź na stronę gdygrasz.pl, bo gdy grasz, wszystko gra.
So we just had an emergency landing in Poland, in Łódź. Yeah, don't worry guys, we won't be here for long. Lads, hello vlog. So I know we were supposed to show you some wild animals and a bit more sun, but
yeah, instead we have to spend 2 days in this boring place.
Come on.
Did you say boring? I will show you beautiful nature and animals and even more. And you will see what this region has to offer. Deal?
So we said yes, because why not, right? And this girl took us around the whole region. We ate pierogies. We saw some Polish art. We saw some wild animals. We got spiritual. And after all, we fell in love with this place.
Mam plan na bezpieczną firmę. To plan firmowy z cybertarczą,
która blokuje zagrożenia w sieci.
Cyberbezpieczeństwo? Masz od tego Orange. Teraz cybertarcza za 0 zł we wszystkich planach firmowych, a w wybranych smartfony 50% taniej. Orange tu jest.
Telewizja Polska to więcej tego, co widzowie cenią najbardziej. Pasjonujące filmy i seriale, a w obsadzie najbardziej gorące nazwiska. Największe sportowe imprezy i momenty, które przejdą do historii. Bieżące wydarzenia, którymi żyje Polska i świat. Przebojowe koncerty, które łączą w zabawie wszystkich Polaków. Znakomite spektakle, które gromadzą rekordową publiczność.